The military auditorium at Fort Hamilton gleamed under the polished weight of tradition. Rows of flags stood tall along the back wall, catching the morning light that filtered through long, narrow windows. Brass shined under fluorescent lights. The air was thick with ceremony, the crisp press of uniforms, the rattle of metals, and the kind of silence that comes only when power enters the room. Dozens of high-ranking officials filled the front rows. Behind them sat soldiers in dress, uniforms, post reporters with notepads, and civilian guests handpicked for their loyalty or influence. Every detail had been rehearsed, down to the synchronized steps of the honor guard. Cameras were stationed at the back, red lights blinking. Ready to capture the moment, the Army added a third star to one of its most decorated generals. General Lawrence Whitaker, a towering man with silver-gray hair and a jaw that looked carved. From granite, strode toward the stage with confident ease. His reputation preceded him, respected by superiors, feared by subordinates. A combat veteran with over 30 years of service, he had commanded forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Africa. Many called him a soldier's general. Others, in hushed tones, whispered different words. In formation on the side stood the soldiers chosen to represent the rank and file, a ceremonial line of the Army's best, positioned to greet the general with salutes as he passed. Among them was Private First Class Elise Monroe, 24 years old, standing at parade rest in her sharply creased Class A uniform. Elise was not the kind of soldier one expected at the center of controversy. She stood 5 feet 6 inches, lean from years of training, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. She'd arrived early that morning, quietly stepping into line like everyone else. Her name was rarely spoken outside of mission reports and field logs, though her actions had earned her respect. A medic with a calm mind and steady hands, Elise had saved lives on the battlefield. Her bronze star was tucked beneath her coat. No one in the room expected her to be the spark dot as General Whitaker moved down the line, returning salutes with practiced precision. The air shifted around him like gravity adjusting. Cameras clicked rhythmically. The room moved with a measured pulse. Each soldier lifted their hand to their brow, holding firm until the general passed. One by one, snap, 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 they saluted. Until he reached Elise. She didn't move. Her boots were locked in place. Her spine straight, her eyes forward. But her hand stayed at her side. General Whitaker paused. It wasn't noticeable at first, just the slightest hitch in his step. But to the soldiers beside her, it was an earthquake. The photographer closest to the front hesitated mid-shot. One of the junior officers stiffened. A whisper passed like a shadow through the back rows. General Whitaker turned slightly, uncertain whether the lack of salute was an oversight, a mistake, or something else entirely. Elise remained motionless. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. 10 seconds, then 15. In military ceremonies, time is measured in precision. A moment too long feels like a breach. And this moment was not just long, it was deafening. The commanding officer in charge of the formation, Captain Reynolds, stepped forward with unease in his posture. He leaned toward Elise and hissed her name under his breath. Monroe, salute, now. Elise didn't blink. Her hands remained at her sides, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at the general. She didn't look at Reynolds. She stood as if rooted to something far deeper than ceremony. The general cleared his throat. Private Monroe, he said quietly, voice low enough that only those in the first few rows could hear. Is there a reason you're not saluting your commanding officer? No response. Just the same silent figure staring forward into the abyss of protocol. I know. The atmosphere had changed completely. It was no longer just a ceremony. It was a question hanging in the air. No one dared move. The silence had turned from uncomfortable to electric. A civilian reporter near the back slowly raised her phone and began filming. Captain Reynolds stepped in again, his voice sharper. "Private, answer the general." Still nothing. Elise didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. That was what unnerved everyone the most. Her expression was calm, controlled, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. A sergeant whispered from the line next to her, trying to snap her out of it. "Elise, don't throw everything away." But Elise wasn't throwing anything away. She was revealing something. General Whitaker looked over his shoulder, clearly debating whether to move on or address the situation more formally. He turned back toward Elise and repeated, louder this time, "Private Monroe, explain yourself." Now more cameras were recording. Every head in the auditorium faced Elise Monroe, a soldier most of them hadn't known an hour ago. But they would. All remember her after this. She took a breath. Her first real movement. Her chest rose slowly, then fell. Her eyes, once forward, now lifted to meet the general's. The hall was still. Even the air felt frozen. She was about to speak, but not yet. She let the weight of silence do the heavy lifting. Whatever she was going to say, it was clear to everyone. Watching, this wasn't defiance for the sake of pride. This wasn't a breakdown. This was intentional, and it had only just begun. The silence didn't break. It sharpened. It expanded until the atmosphere in the auditorium no longer felt ceremonial. It felt dangerous. General Whitaker straightened, his posture exact. He was a man used to control, a leader who'd commanded. War zones and boardrooms alike, but at this moment, he couldn't command the stillness around Elise Monroe. Her defiance, so quiet and unshaking, struck him harder than a shouted insult or raised fist ever could. People didn't disobey protocol at his ceremonies. He tried again, this time projecting his voice slightly louder, his tone clipped. "Private Monroe, do you understand the meaning of this ceremony?" Elise didn't nod. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained by her side, but she was no longer simply at attention. She was unmovable, as if rooted to something deeper than the polished floor beneath her. Captain Reynolds hovered just to her left, sweat forming at the edge of his brow. He looked to the general, then back to Elise, unsure whether to force action or stand down. There was no protocol for this moment. At least, none that prepared them for such silent defiance in front of cameras, politicians, press, and ranking officers. "I'm giving you a direct order," the general said with finality, lowering his voice, but adding force to each syllable. "Salute your commanding officer." The words hit the air like a hammer, but Elise didn't shatter. Instead, her gaze lifted and met his. Not aggressively, not rebelliously. It was the kind of gaze that said she'd already lived through worse than anything that could happen here. A gaze not hardened by rage, but carved by truth. And still, she said nothing. The soldiers standing around her began to shift, just slightly, as if gravity had shifted, and they didn't quite know where to place their weight. It felt wrong to move, wrong to blink. One soldier across the formation, a young corporal, suddenly felt like he was watching something sacred being undone, but he wasn't sure which part of it was sacred anymore. A civilian journalist, seated in the press section, quietly leaned over to a cameraman. "Get a close-up of her face," she whispered. "She's not scared." Another officer near the stage checked his watch, then exchanged a glance with a Pentagon representative in the front row. There were protocols for disruptive behavior. Of course, but was this disruptive? Or was it revelatory? Reynolds stepped forward again, tension radiating through his spine. He spoke in a low whisper just behind Elise's ear. "Don't do this. You're ruining your entire career. Don't throw it all away over some personal grudge. This is a 3-star promotion, not the place." Still, Elise didn't speak. Her lips were set with quiet resolve, but her eyes flickered just briefly, acknowledging the whisper, but dismissing its threat. She didn't flinch because she didn't feel the danger. The danger had already come and gone 2 years ago on foreign soil, when her voice didn't matter and her orders were ignored. This wasn't her losing control. This was her finally taking it back. From the back of the room, a senior non-commissioned officer began to move toward the formation, likely tasked with quietly escorting Elise out before things got worse. But even he hesitated mid-step. Something in the air made it hard to move against her. Not because she threatened anyone, but because she didn't need to. She was standing in the exact eye of the storm, and everyone else was starting to feel the wind change. General Whitaker had always prided himself on knowing how to diffuse pressure. In field operations, that skill had saved lives. In Washington, it had protected careers. But here, something was different. He looked at Elise again. She was no longer just a private. She had become a question, a challenge, an unspoken accusation. One he didn't yet understand, and one he wasn't prepared for. He tried a different approach. "I've read your file, Monroe," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're a decorated medic. Bronze Star, clean record. 2 years active. Deployment. You've saved lives. People admire you. So why now? Why today?" She blinked, once, slowly. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Even the air seemed to lean forward. But still, Elise remained silent. This wasn't about rebellion. This was about timing. And this was her moment. Not his dock. Captain Reynolds took another step forward, but Elise finally moved. Just one subtle motion. Her head turning slightly to face the general, not fully, but enough. Her expression hadn't changed, but her silence suddenly felt loaded. She was going to speak, not a speech, not a protest, just the truth. But not yet. The silence still had work to do. Reynolds stopped in his tracks, as if she'd issued a silent command. Perhaps she had. People in the room began whispering now. Names were being typed into phones. Elise Monroe. Who was she? What had she seen? What did she know? The general gave her one last chance. "Private, I am giving you a lawful order. You are to salute your commanding officer." That word lawful was not used lightly, but Elise did not budge. The journalists knew something had just shifted. The ones who'd come for the photo op now found themselves witnesses to something far more serious. She finally opened her mouth, but only to breathe in. A measured, practiced breath. Her eyes met Whitaker's, and for a moment, he looked into them not as a general, but as a man who had made choices that left ghosts in their wake. The room wasn't tense anymore. It was cracked wide open. She didn't need a microphone. When she spoke next, the room would hear her, and no one, not the general, not the brass, not even the audience watching from home, was prepared for what 6 simple words could do. Before Elise Monroe became the still center of a military scandal, she was something far less visible, a quiet professional, a medic with a reputation for efficiency, discretion, and bravery in situations most people couldn't begin to imagine. She didn't volunteer for attention. In fact, she often disappeared behind her work. During basic, she was the one who stayed late after lights out, patching up sprains and organizing supplies while others rested. On deployment, she was the one who remembered everyone's blood type, allergy history, and family back home. The kind of soldier you wanted near you when things went wrong. And they often did. In Afghanistan, she stabilized a bleeding lieutenant during a night raid when their convoy hit an IED. In Iraq, she pulled a wounded translator out from under rubble when a mortar strike shattered the walls of their safe house. In Syria, she once worked on 3 different casualties simultaneously, her gloves soaked, her face calm, never once raising her voice. She was only 24, but already a lifeline for others. That's why people were confused. Why would someone like her, a soldier with commendations, awards, and nothing to gain from making a scene, refuse to salute a general in front of the entire base? Why risk her career, her record, everything she had built? The answer wasn't written in her personnel file. It wasn't in her performance evaluations or her medical school acceptance letter that sat unsigned in a desk drawer. It wasn't in the Bronze Star citation, which praised her for unshakable calm under fire and exceptional life-saving response. Those words were all true, but they weren't complete. The real answer was buried deep somewhere between sand and gunfire, somewhere in a desert where decisions made in air-conditioned command centers cost real people their lives. Her fellow medics respected her but didn't know her. That was by design. Elise didn't talk much about her past or her feelings. She kept things close. Too close, some might have said, but she hadn't always been this way. When she enlisted at 20, she was hopeful, idealistic even. She believed in duty, service, honor, the values printed in every recruiting pamphlet. She believed that the military was a place where sacrifice meant something. And maybe, for a while, it was. Then came Syria. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, the kind they'd done a dozen times before. Elise's unit, a mixed detachment of engineers, medics, and security detail, was tasked with checking a village on the outskirts of Aleppo for weapons caches. The threat level was listed as low. She went because she was needed. She always went. But that day, something went wrong. Insurgents had flooded the village before their arrival. Intelligence hadn't caught it. Or maybe it had, and someone up the chain dismissed it. No one knew for sure, at least. No one on the ground. They were ambushed at the edge of the village. The first bullet shattered the windshield of their lead vehicle. Then came the grenades. Chaos. Smoke. Screaming. Radios crackled, and Elise immediately began assessing injuries. 2 soldiers were already down. She dragged one to cover behind a broken wall while bullets snapped past her helmet. She radioed for support 3 times. Each time, she was told that no backup was coming. The last voice on the line sounded nervous, conflicted. Orders came from above, he'd said. No extraction. You're on your own. She didn't have time to process that. Corporal Jamie Rivera, her best friend since training, was hit trying to pull a wounded local boy to safety. He collapsed in front of her, gasping for air as blood pooled around them. Elise dropped everything and pressed her hands to his stomach. She kept him alive for 37 minutes. No help came. No drones, no air support, no reinforcements. And then he was gone. That was the moment something inside Elise changed. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a door closing. Later in the debriefing, she asked about the support denial. The officers exchanged glances and told her it was classified. When she pressed, they became cold. 1 month later, she heard through a staff sergeant that Colonel Lawrence Whitaker had overruled the mission's support request based on insufficient threat verification. He had looked at a map, read a report, and decided they didn't need help. He was wrong. She never told anyone what that did to her. How many nights she sat awake in her cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying Jamie's last breath. How she started writing letters she never sent. How she trained harder, worked longer, medicated other people's pain, just to stay numb to her own. By the time she returned stateside, she had learned to compartmentalize it all. She didn't talk about Jamie. She didn't talk about Syria. And she never spoke the name Whitaker. Until today. Now, she stood in front of the same man who had signed her friend's death warrant without ever setting foot on the battlefield. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. To him, she was a name buried in a mission summary. Just another soldier in uniform. Forgettable. Replaceable. But Elise hadn't forgotten him. And she never would. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about rage. It was about responsibility. If no one ever said anything, the system would go on, unchanged, still killing, still denying, still burying the truth behind medals and promotions. Elise didn't want a medal. She wanted accountability. She had no illusions that her act would change everything. But maybe it would change something. Maybe one truth, spoken clearly, could shake the foundation just enough to let some light in. And that's why she stood there now, silent, unmoving, risking everything because someone had to. And she had nothing left to lose. The heat in northern Syria was unlike anything Elise Monroe had felt before. It wasn't just the sun pressing down. It was the way the earth itself seemed to radiate history, tension, and blood. Sand and wind filled every crack of the armored. Humvee as her unit rolled through the outskirts of a village just past dawn. Dust rose behind them like ghosts. They had done this before. Secure. Sweep. Report. Repeat. Their mission that day was reconnaissance. Simple in theory. Quiet. No expected contact. Just a grid sweep of a farming village recently flagged for suspicious movement. Locals had reported the presence of unidentified men with weapons, but intelligence had marked it as unverified. That single word, as Elise would learn, carried deadly weight. She rode in the second vehicle, checking her medical bag for the third time that morning. Bandages, tourniquets, IVs. The ritual of readiness gave her focus. She rode across war zones. Not as a warrior, but as a lifeline. That was her role. That was her belief. Save who you can. Carry what others can't. Corporal Jamie Rivera sat across from her, grinning under his helmet. "When we get back," he said, tapping a folded piece of paper tucked into his sleeve, "I'm finally going to ask her out. Swear to God." Elise smirked. "You've said that the last 3 times. "Yeah, but this time I bought cologne." "Cologne?" She laughed. "We're in the desert. A man has to be prepared," he said with a wink. "Besides, you never know when the world might give you a clean slate." It was the last joke he'd ever make. As their convoy entered the village perimeter, everything seemed calm. Chickens scattered across the road. A child peeked from behind a metal fence. Shops stood closed. The sun climbed. Nothing seemed out of place until the sharp crack of a rifle shattered the air. Then came the second shot. Chaos erupted. Elise's driver slammed the brakes, the vehicle jolting to a stop. Bullets pinged off the metal like hail. The first Humvee up ahead was smoking. Someone was yelling for cover. She threw open the back door and sprinted into the open, dropping behind a half-destroyed wall as the village transformed into a battlefield. Her earpiece came alive with overlapping voices. "We're under fire. Ambush from the north. Requesting immediate air support." Elise pressed against the wall, forcing her breath under control. Then she heard the scream. Jamie. She turned toward the sound and saw him sprawled near a doorway, dragging himself with one arm, blood streaming down his torso. A boy no older than 12 was pinned beside him, crying in shock. Jamie had thrown himself in front of the child when the shots began. Without hesitation, Elise moved. She ran low, dodging gunfire, and slid beside them. Jamie was bleeding. Fast abdomen, lower chest. Arterial. Bad. She yanked open his vest and applied pressure. "Stay with me," she said. He coughed, blood flecking his lips. She keyed the radio. "This is Medic Monroe, multiple wounded, including a child. We need Kesivec, immediate air support. Coordinates transmitting now." The answer came too quickly. "Negative, Monroe. No extraction approved. Hold your position." repeating, "No." "Air support. Orders from Colonel Whitaker." She stared at the radio. "Say again?" she snapped. "Orders from command. Intel deemed the threat insufficient. No backup authorized." She looked down at Jamie. His skin had gone pale. She tore open a clotting agent and pushed it into the wound, her hands slick with blood. "Stay with me. I've got you." He shook his head weakly. "Elle, no one's coming." No, don't say that. "You're not going anywhere." He tried to smile, even as his breath grew shallow. "You always were the stubborn one. Shut up and stay awake." His hand gripped hers tight, even with the blood loss. "Tell them. Promise me. Don't let them bury it." "I promise," she whispered, and then he was gone. She sat with him for a full minute before moving. The child clung to her side, silent. Somewhere in the background, the gunfire had quieted. Reinforcements finally arrived 20 minutes later, when it no longer mattered. Later, in the makeshift field hospital, she stood at attention while a briefing officer explained that intel failure had been the cause of the mishap. She asked who denied the air support, got the answer. Colonel Whitaker. He had reviewed the initial threat report and deemed it low priority. He didn't see it necessary to risk assets on unconfirmed engagement zones. When Elise requested access to the communications log, she was denied. When she submitted a written report detailing the timeline, she was told not to submit it outside of proper channels. When she mentioned Jamie's name, no one said anything. Weeks passed, then months. She redeployed home. Her commendation arrived in the mail. She was recommended for officer training, but she couldn't forget, not the gunfire, not the boy, not the voice on the radio casually dismissing their lives from thousands of miles away. The name Whitaker carved itself into her memory, not as a man, but as a symbol of a system that expected soldiers to bleed quietly. So when she read the announcement of his promotion to general, scheduled to be held at Fort Hamilton, the same base she had just transferred to, she didn't feel fear. She felt clarity. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't staging protest. She was doing what no one else had the courage to do. She was remembering. And soon, the whole world would remember with her. General Lawrence Whitaker was not accustomed to uncertainty, not in himself, and certainly not in the soldiers under his command. His career had been built on precision, confidence, and unquestioned authority. Even under fire, even in political halls far from battlefields, he had always controlled the room. But not this one. Standing before a silent private first-class Elise Monroe, with dozens of soldiers watching and half a dozen cameras recording. That control was slipping through his fingers. He cleared his throat once more. "Private Monroe," he said, slower this time. "You are being insubordinate in front of military command. You are refusing a lawful order. Are you aware of the consequences?" Elise remained perfectly still, but her gaze didn't waver. There was no fear in her eyes. No panic, only a steady, deliberate calm that unnerved even those who didn't understand. What was happening? To the room, she looked like a soldier gone still. But to Whitaker, who was trained to read people, she looked like someone readying herself for a blow, not from him, but from memory. Captain Reynolds took a cautious step forward. "Sir, may I request we handle this offstage?" He whispered. "This situation is escalating." Whitaker didn't respond. His pride, his instinct, and his reputation wouldn't allow a retreat. Not in front of this crowd. Not from a junior medic. And certainly not today. Not on the day he was to receive his 3rd star. Instead, he looked Elise directly in the eyes. "Say something," he said. "If you have something to say it now. Or follow the order you've been given." For a heartbeat, Elise didn't move. Then slowly, very slowly, she lifted her chin. Her body was still, but her presence shifted. It was no longer the presence of a subordinate. It was something else entirely. Something that made several nearby officers stand straighter without even realizing it. People leaned in. The air was heavy, but charged. It was the anticipation before thunder. She blinked once. Then finally, her voice, quiet but razor-sharp, filled the space between them. "Do you remember Corporal Jamie Rivera?" The question hit Whitaker like a sudden gust of wind. He blinked. It was a name. A random one, at first glance. 2. Anyone else, just another name in the endless stream of deployment logs. But Whitaker paused. Too long. Too obviously. His throat moved slightly, as if swallowing something dry. Elise continued. "Northern Syria. Kandahar Detachment. Operation Iron Vow." Now the room shifted again. Officers glanced at each other. The press raised their cameras. This wasn't defiance anymore. This was a confrontation rooted in history. Whitaker straightened his posture, clenching his jaw. "I read every report. I review every mission. If mistakes were made, they were regrettable. But war is chaos." That sentence, neatly delivered, landed with a thud. Elise didn't blink. No, it wasn't chaos. It was a decision. You read one intel brief. 1. You dismissed the threat level and denied air support. You left us out there. We lost 3 soldiers. 1 bled out in my arms while I begged for help over the radio. That decision was yours. The auditorium, filled just minutes earlier with stiff applause and structured ceremony, now fell into total stillness. No one moved. No one breathed. Every phone in the room was recording. Whitaker's face remained hard, but his eyes flickered with something. Not guilt, not yet, but awareness. The name. The mission. The denial. It all rushed back like distant thunder he had once managed to ignore. Elise stepped forward. Just one step, but it was enough to feel seismic. "I was there," she said, "and I've waited 2 years to say this. You didn't just fail to support us. You dismissed us. You wrote off our lives like a scheduling conflict." Reynolds made a sound behind her, as if to step in, but the general raised a hand. "Let her speak," he said quietly, and then Elise did. She looked him square in the eyes and delivered the sentence the world would remember. 6 simple words. You left them. I remember everything. The words were not shouted. They weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of the battlefield, the screams in the dust, the dead boy in Jamie's arms, the blood on her gloves, and the cold, indifferent silence of a denied radio call. You left them. I remember everything. The impact was instant. A hush deeper than before. The kind of silence people feel in their bones. It wasn't just that she accused him. It was that she told the truth. Plainly, UNFLINCHINGLY. Whitaker took a step back. His expression hardened into stone, but something beneath it cracked. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. For once in his career, he had no script, no prepared response, no line to throw back. In the second row, a Pentagon official leaned toward another and whispered something. One of the reporters had already begun uploading the clip. Elise stood firm. She didn't look victorious. She looked steady. Hold. Her act wasn't about rebellion. It was about remembrance. And as the whispers grew and the cameras clicked again, General Whitaker, 3 stars or not, understood that something irreversible had happened. She had spoken, and the room would never be the same. You left them? I remember everything. Elise Monroe's 6 words didn't need volume. They didn't need anger. They landed like a blade sliding into silence. Clean and irreversible. In the immediate moment after she spoke, the room felt vacuum sealed. Not even the buzzing of overhead lights dared intrude. People had seen scandals before. They'd seen public arguments, military breakdowns, heated debates. But no one in that room had ever witnessed truth spoken so plainly, with such composure, in front of so much power. Elise didn't look away. Her face remained calm, controlled. Her voice wasn't shaking. Her fists weren't clenched. Her shoulders didn't drop for relief. She had said what she came to say, and now she stood in the space that truth had cleared, unflinching. General Whitaker stood across from her, blinking slowly, as if trying to process whether what had just happened was real. His mouth tightened, not into a sneer or a frown, but into something unreadable. He had spent decades wearing the mask of authority, and for the first time, that mask cracked. Behind him, movement stirred. A colonel leaned to whisper to a senior official. A sergeant stepped toward Elise, unsure if they were supposed to escort her away or applaud her. No orders were being given. No clear protocol existed for what had just taken place. It was as if the chain of command had short-circuited. Captain Reynolds, hovering nearby, looked stunned. He had served long enough to witness the aftershocks of military whistleblowing. But this was different. Elise hadn't leaked documents. She hadn't staged a protest. She hadn't written a scathing op-ed or organized a sit-in. She had just spoken. The reporter from the Stars and Stripes newspaper was already typing furiously. Another journalist leaned down, whispering into her phone, feeding a live update to her editor. Private calls out General Whitaker. Mid-ceremony, accuses him of abandoning soldiers during Syrian deployment. Quote, "You left them. I remember everything. It's everywhere already." Elise heard none of it. Her ears were still filled with Jamie's last words. Her body, though steady, carried the weight of years of silence. She hadn't planned to say exactly those words, but when they left her mouth, she knew they were right. Not clever. Not calculated. Just right, because that was the truth. Whitaker finally spoke. "There are things," he said carefully, "you cannot understand at your level." His voice was quieter now, less sure. Each word seemed weighed down. Elise didn't reply. She had already said what mattered. He continued, perhaps more to the room than to her. War isn't clean. It's not a movie. It's risk calculations. It's incomplete information. We make decisions based on what we know. Sometimes, he paused, sometimes we get it wrong. He didn't say I got it wrong. He didn't say I'm sorry. Elise caught that. So did everyone else. Her eyes narrowed, but she remained silent. It was the crowd now that shifted. Murmurs spread like a rising tide. Soldiers glanced at each other. Some stiffened with discomfort. Others softened, realizing they weren't alone. In their memories of denial and decisions made far from danger, Elise had cracked something wide open. Not just a moment. A system. It wasn't long before the commanding officer of the base, Brigadier General Hafford, approached the podium and quietly took over the ceremony. With diplomatic poise, he thanked everyone for their presence and formally postponed the remaining agenda. No explanation was given. None was needed. As people began to leave, no one looked at Whitaker the same way. Some avoided his eyes entirely. Others stared too long. He turned slowly and walked toward the exit. The cameras stayed on Elise. She stood motionless. Only after the general left the room did she exhale. Captain Reynolds approached her cautiously. "You should come with me, Private," he said gently. She nodded, not submissively, simply ready. He escorted her toward the hall. No handcuffs, no yelling, no shame. She passed by other soldiers who stood at the edge of formation. A few nodded at her. One gave the faintest, silent salute. Outside the auditorium, the sun had risen fully over Fort Hamilton. Birds chirped like it was any other Monday. But the base buzzed with something electric. Everyone had seen the footage. The clip was already trending on military forums, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. She didn't flinch. "Did you see his face?" 6 words, that's all she said. By noon, civilian news anchors were recapping the moment in real time. The Pentagon issued a statement promising a review of the events that occurred during the ceremony, with full transparency and respect for military process. Whitaker had no public comment. Elise remained quiet, declining interviews. She didn't need to say anything else. Her 6 words had said it all. In the following days, veterans began sharing eerily similar stories on social media. Denied requests, delayed responses, command decisions that cost lives. The hashtag she remembers everything trended across platforms. What started as a moment had become a reckoning. Elise didn't seek vindication. She wasn't building a brand or chasing a movement. She simply did what she knew Jamie would have done. If the roles were reversed, tell the truth. Make it known. She didn't regret it. She slept that night better than she had in 2 years. For the first time, she felt seen, not for her medals, not for her rank, but for the truth she carried. The world finally had listened. Within 24 hours of the ceremony, Elise Monroe's 6 words had reached millions. The clip was shared across every major platform, replayed by news anchors with solemn voices and dissected by military analysts in evening specials. Her calm composure, her simple yet damning sentence, and the stunned look on General Whitaker's face became one of the most talked about moments in recent military history. The Department of Defense issued a brief statement on the morning after. "We are aware of the incident that occurred during General Whitaker's promotion ceremony at Fort Hamilton. An internal review has been initiated to determine the facts surrounding the soldier's statement and any operational decisions related to the matter." It was carefully worded, neutral, clinical, but behind closed doors, the Pentagon was anything but calm. In the basement of the Arlington headquarters, a team of military lawyers and high-ranking officers sat around a long table reviewing the mission reports from Syria. Words like optics, command integrity, and collateral impact floated through the room. General Whitaker, meanwhile, remained out of sight. His public appearances were canceled. His promotion was placed on temporary hold. No official statement came from his office. Just silence, which, for someone who had commanded global operations, spoke volumes. Elise, on the other hand, was facing a different kind of attention. At Fort Hamilton, she was quietly removed from duty for a wellness assessment. They didn't call it punishment, but everyone understood what it meant. It was a political pause, a containment strategy. They wanted time to breathe, to assess the damage, but the world wouldn't wait. Veterans across the country began speaking out. Soldiers who had served under Whitaker started sharing their own stories. Delayed requests, overruled calls for support, tactical decisions that cost lives. Some were anonymous, others were not. A retired intelligence officer named Malcolm Price posted a 3-minute video on social media. "I remember that Syria operation," he said. "I wasn't on the ground like Monroe, but I reviewed the intelligence afterward. The field team's request for support was solid. It was Whitaker who shut it down. She's telling the truth." His words added fuel to a fire that was already burning through the military's polished surface. Within days, investigative journalists began compiling a list of questionable missions under Whitaker's command. A once untouchable general was now under scrutiny, and Elise Monroe's name was being spoken in every briefing room that mattered. At first, Elise stayed quiet. She declined interviews. She ignored her rapidly growing inbox, filled with everything, from threats to praise to offers from documentary filmmakers. Her name was trending, but she wasn't chasing the spotlight. She had spoken her truth, and that had been enough. Still, the silence around her grew heavy. One afternoon, sitting alone in the barracks, she opened her laptop and read one of the thousands of emails. It was from Jamie Rivera's mother. "Elise, I saw what you did. I never knew what happened. They told me he died in combat, serving honorably. But they never told me he died, waiting for help that never came. You gave me back my son's truth. Thank you. I'm proud of you. And I know he would be too." Elise stared at the message for a long time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the ache of delayed grief finally finding a way out. The next day, she met with her base commander in a quiet office on the 3rd floor. General Hafford was a man of measured tone and careful posture, but he spoke directly. "You've caused a storm, Private," he said, hands folded neatly on the desk. "And whether you meant to or not, you've pulled a curtain back on something we can't ignore anymore." She didn't respond immediately. Then, softly, "I didn't want to cause chaos. I just didn't want to stay silent." He nodded. "And you didn't. I've been ordered to reassign you. Not as punishment, as protection. You'll be transferred to the Department of Veteran Affairs, Washington. They're setting up a new program for battlefield medics transitioning into advocacy and trauma response. They want you involved." Elise blinked. "Is that a demotion?" "No," he said. "It's the opposite. It's purpose." A week later, Elise left Fort Hamilton under the radar. No press, no ceremony, no attention. Just a duffel bag. And a quiet salute from the guards at the gate. In Washington, she found herself in a small office on the 8th floor of a new VA wing. There were no gold stars on the door, no brass nameplates. Just a desk, a laptop, and a program in development aimed at helping medics like her turn their experience into something lasting. She didn't wear her uniform every day now. Sometimes she just wore jeans and a t-shirt and worked through Survivor, interviews, medical claims, and reform drafts. And for the first time since Jamie's death, she felt like she was still fighting for something that mattered. Meanwhile, General Whitaker was placed under formal investigation. His retirement was accelerated. His promotion was canceled. No charges were filed, but his legacy had changed. History would remember him not for the medals or the missions, but for the moment he stood in front of a quiet soldier who reminded the world what leadership is supposed to look like. Elise never gloated. She never needed to dot in the end. It wasn't about ruining a man. It was about honoring the fallen, about speaking what others couldn't, about refusing to let silence bury the truth. Words did more than expose a decision. They revealed a system. They cracked it open. And once the truth escaped, it didn't go back. 6 months had passed since Elise Monroe stood on that stage and stunned a room full of brass and cameras with just 6 words. "You left them. I remember everything." Now, in the quiet hum of a Washington office building, those words echoed. In a different way, not as a confrontation, but as a foundation. A new initiative, called Project Echo, had launched within the Department of Veterans Affairs, designed specifically to give active duty medics, nurses, and frontline personnel a voice in post-deployment care, military policy feedback, and trauma-informed. Field Operations. Elise didn't create the project alone, but it wouldn't have existed without her. That much was clear. The first day Project Echo opened its doors, dozens of calls came in. Former soldiers from every branch of service wanted to share stories, not of heroism or medals, but of the moments they'd never talked about. Missions that went wrong, orders that didn't make sense, names that never made the final reports. Elise listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush anyone. She just listened, the same way she used to kneel in the dirt beside a bleeding comrade and focus on their heartbeat. Now she listened for the heartbeat of truth, slow, fragile, but present. Her quiet approach earned the respect of people who normally didn't trust systems. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't trying to build a brand. She was just doing what she'd always done, showing up. By the second month, Project Echo had a waitlist. By the third, the Department of Defense reached out with an unprecedented offer. An advisory council built of field medics, trauma surgeons, and mental health specialists to review command decisions on future deployments. Elise was asked to join as a founding member. She hesitated. It wasn't fear that made her pause. It was the weight of responsibility. She hadn't spoken out to build a career. She had spoken for Jamie, for the others, for the ones who never came back. But maybe this was exactly what they would have wanted, a seat at the table where decisions were made. She said yes. Back at Fort Hamilton, her name was still spoken, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in caution. Some soldiers called her brave. Others called her dangerous. But no one called her wrong. One afternoon, a young female recruit named Sarah Morales walked into the Echo office wearing her dress blues. She looked nervous, holding a folder in one hand. "I don't know if I'm in the right place," she said, eyes darting around. Police stood, offered a quiet smile, and motioned her to sit. "If you're here to tell the truth," she said, "you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Sarah began to cry, not loudly, just the slow kind of tears that come from holding too much in for too long. She hadn't told anyone what she'd seen in Iraq, not until now. Elise sat with her for 2 hours. When the meeting ended, Sarah left lighter. This was what mattered. Meanwhile, the media had moved on, as they always did. A new scandal had taken over the headlines. New wars, new faces. But among soldiers, Elise's moment had become a touchstone. There were T-shirts with her words printed on the back. There were posters in barracks that simply read, "Remember everything." But Elise didn't care about symbols. She cared about stories. Sometimes, late at night, she'd read Jamie Rivera's final journal entries. His sister had mailed her the notebook. After the ceremony went viral. One entry read, "We all pretend not to be afraid, but Elise, she doesn't pretend. She just stares into the dark and keeps going." That's the kind of medic you want near you when things fall apart. That line never left her. Jamie's mother called once a month now, just to check in. They spoke like family, the kind of family built not by blood, but by battle. As Elise walked through her new life, the boardrooms, the policy meetings, the field support calls, she never forgot where it started. Not with a microphone, not with ambition, but with a single choice. To not salute. To not stand silent. To remember. General Whitaker quietly retired and moved to a private estate in Colorado. Occasionally, journalists still tried to reach him for comment. He never gave one. He never would. His story had ended the moment Elise told hers. Elise, on the other hand, was just getting started. In April, she was invited to speak at a military academy. It was the first time she stood behind a podium since the ceremony. The hall was full of young cadets. Some stared at her like she was a legend. Others looked skeptical. But all of them listened. "I'm not here to teach you how to follow orders," she began, her voice steady. "You'll get plenty of that. I'm here to remind you that leadership is not about stars or titles. It's about owning your choices. It's about standing beside the people you send into danger, even if you never set foot on the field." She paused. "Someday, you may have to choose between your comfort and the truth. When that day comes, I hope you remember 6 words." She looked out at the crowd. "You left them. I remember everything." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was respectful. She didn't need a standing ovation. She just needed to know someone was listening. And they were. They always would. The end.